The diner buzzed with the quiet hum of chatter and clinking silverware as people settled in for their meals. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, small, warm, and welcoming. The air smelled of coffee and pancakes, with a faint hint of bacon sizzling in the kitchen. Near the corner window, a 90-year-old veteran named Mr. Henry sat alone, sipping his black coffee. His weathered face told a story of countless battles, both on and off the battlefield. The medals pinned neatly on his jacket were a silent testament to the years of service he had given to his country. Henry didn't come to the diner often, but when he did, it was his time to reflect, to enjoy a quiet moment. However, this peaceful afternoon was about to take a sharp turn. The calm was broken by the roar of motorcycles pulling up outside. One by one, a group of bikers, loud, rowdy, and dressed in leather, stormed into the diner. Their laughter echoed through the room as they claimed the largest table in the center, drawing every eye in the room. The staff seemed uneasy, the other patrons growing quieter with each passing second. But Henry kept his eyes on his coffee, trying to ignore the chaos. The bikers, however, thrived on attention. They cracked jokes at the expense of the staff, demanded extra service, and disrupted the previously serene atmosphere. One of the bikers, a man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running across his cheek, noticed Henry sitting alone. A sly grin crept onto his face. Well, he said loudly. "Look at the old soldier over there. Bet he's got some more stories to tell." Huh. The group erupted into laughter. Henry didn't flinch, though his grip on the coffee cup tightened ever so slightly. The scarred biker wasn't done. He walked over, his heavy boots thudding against the tiled floor. "Hey, Grandpa," he sneered, leaning over the table. "How about you buy a round for us? You must have got some nice military pension sitting around, right?" The room fell silent. The diner stared, unsure of what would happen next. Henry slowly looked up, his piercing blue eyes meeting the biker's taunting gaze. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. It was the kind of look that could unnerve even the toughest of men. But the biker wasn't easily intimidated. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he mocked, slamming his hand on the table. Henry placed his cup down carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. His voice, when he spoke, was low but steady. "Son, you don't want to start something you can't finish." The biker laughed again, this time louder, signaling his gang to join in. "Oh, is that a threat, old man?" he said, feigning fear. "What are you gonna do? Call your war buddies? Looks like the only battle you'll be fighting is getting out of that chair." Henry leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving the bikers. Then, with a calmness that unnerved everyone, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The biker raised an eyebrow, confused for a moment. "What's this? Gonna call the cops?" he said with a smirk. "Go ahead. They'll probably take just as long to show up as you take to stand." Henry didn't respond. Instead, he calmly dialed a number and placed the phone to his ear. His words were simple, quiet, and laced with a confidence that sent a chill down the biker's spine. "It's Henry. I need you here." He ended the call without another word, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The diner was so silent you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. The biker hesitated for the first time, his bravado faltering just slightly. "Who'd you call, old man?" he asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. Henry simply picked up his coffee again and took a slow sip. "You'll find out soon enough." The biker scoffed, trying to regain his composure as he turned back to his group. "Old man thinks he's got some kind of backup coming," he said, his voice louder than before, trying to drown out his own uncertainty. The rest of the bikers laughed along with him, raising their glasses and making crude jokes at Henry's expense. But something about Henry's calm demeanor didn't sit right with a few of the other diners. Whispers began to circulate among the tables, and even the diner staff exchanged nervous glances. Henry, however, remained perfectly still, his focus on his coffee as if he hadn't just made a phone call that promised to change the dynamic in the room. The scarred biker wasn't finished. He leaned against Henry's table, invading his space, his grin wide but forced. So what's the big plan, huh? You think someone's just gonna walk through that door and make us leave? Let me tell you something, Grandpa. We don't scare easy. Henry didn't respond. His silence, coupled with the steely gaze he fixed on the biker, was unsettling. For a moment, the man looked as though he might back off, but his ego wouldn't allow it. He slammed his fist on the table, causing Henry's coffee cup to rattle against the saucer. The sound startled the other patrons, and a young waitress dropped the tray she was holding. Plates shattered against the floor, and the noise broke the tense silence in the room. The biker turned his head sharply toward her. "Hey, watch it!" he barked, his tone as sharp as the look in his eyes. The waitress, barely more than a teenager, froze in place, her hands trembling. Henry's eyes flickered toward her for a moment before returning to the biker. There was something in his gaze, a quiet fury that made the scarred man shift uncomfortably. But before he could step away, the distant rumble of engines filled the air. The sound grew louder, cutting through the nervous chatter in the diner like a knife. The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter faltering. Even the scarred leader turned toward the window, his expression shifting from arrogance to mild concern. Outside, a line of vehicles approached. SUVs, trucks, and motorcycles, each one polished to perfection and bearing markings that immediately caught the attention of anyone familiar with the military. Flags fluttered on some of the vehicles, and as they pulled into the diner's parking lot, men and women in uniform began stepping out. They weren't ordinary soldiers. These were veterans, each one wearing a badge or patch that identified them as part of an elite unit. Some carried themselves with the ease of retirees who had seen and done it all, while others had the sharp, precise movements of those still active in service. The scarred biker's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The other bikers shifted uneasily in their seats, their earlier bravado dissolving into nervous energy. The door to the diner swung open, and a tall man in a crisp uniform stepped inside. His presence alone seemed to command the room. He scanned the diner briefly before his eyes landed on Henry. A smile broke across his face as he approached the old veteran. "Colonel Henry," the man said, his voice filled with respect. "It's been too long." Henry stood slowly, his back straight despite his age. "Captain Briggs," he said, extending a hand. "Good to see you." The two men shook hands, their grip firm. Behind them, more veterans began filing into the diner, their sheer number overwhelming the small space. The bikers now looked cornered, their confident postures replaced by tense stares. The scarred biker swallowed hard, his earlier smugness completely gone. Who are these people?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Henry glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Friends," he said simply. "Lifelong friends." Captain Briggs turned to the scarred biker, his expression hardening. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The biker stammered, "And no problem at all. We were just talking." "Talking, huh?" Briggs said, crossing his arms. "That's not what it looked like from the window." Henry stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "It's all right, Captain. I think they've learned their lesson. Haven't you?" The scarred biker nodded quickly, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Yeah, we're good. Just a misunderstanding." Henry didn't respond, his silence more intimidating than any words could have been. The veterans didn't move either, their presence enough to keep the bikers frozen in place. The atmosphere in the diner was electric, the power dynamic completely reversed. As the tension hung in the air, the scarred biker glanced nervously at his group. "Come on, guys, let's go." But Captain Briggs wasn't finished. "Not so fast," he said, his voice like steel. "You're going to apologize. To the colonel, to the staff, and to everyone in this diner." The scarred biker hesitated, his pride warring with the fear clearly written on his face. "Apologize?" he repeated, as though the word tasted bitter. "You heard me," Briggs said, taking a step closer. "Now." The room was silent again, the tension palpable as everyone waited to see what the biker would do. The scarred biker stood frozen, his jaw clenched tightly as the weight of Captain Briggs's demand bore down on him. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the diner's refrigerator felt deafening. All eyes were on the man who had moments ago seemed so confident and untouchable. His companions shifted uneasily in their seats, avoiding eye contact, clearly wanting no part in defying the imposing figures now surrounding them. "Apologize," the biker finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "Louder," Briggs said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "Say it so everyone can hear you." The biker hesitated, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. Finally, he straightened up and glanced at Henry. I'm sorry," he said, the words strained and reluctant. Henry didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unchanging. But Captain Briggs wasn't satisfied. "Not just to him," he said. "To the staff and the rest of the diners too." The scarred biker turned toward the waitress who was still standing by the counter, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her apron. "I'm sorry," he said, slightly louder this time, though the bitterness in his tone was clear. He then looked around the room at the other diners, avoiding eye contact but muttering, "Sorry," as if it physically pained him to say the words. Captain Briggs exchanged a glance with Henry, and the older man gave a slight nod. "That'll do," Briggs said, stepping back slightly, though his stance remained firm and authoritative. "Now take your group and leave. And if I ever hear about you bothering anyone else again, I won't be so forgiving." The scarred biker nodded quickly, his bravado completely drained. He motioned for his group to get up, and they followed his lead without question. Their earlier rowdiness had vanished, replaced by shame and discomfort. They shuffled out of the diner, avoiding the stares of the veterans and patrons alike. The sound of the diner door closing behind them was like a release valve for the tension in the room. The other diners and staff let out a collective sigh of relief, and a few even began clapping softly. The waitress who had been the target of the biker's aggression approached Henry cautiously. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know what was going to happen." Henry smiled kindly at her. "You've got nothing to thank me for," he said. "No one should have to deal with people like that." Captain Briggs stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. "It's good to see you haven't lost your edge, Colonel," he said with a grin. "You always knew how to handle trouble." Henry chuckled softly. "I've had a lot of practice," he said, "but I didn't handle this one alone. Thanks for showing up so quickly." Briggs nodded. "You know we've always got your back." He turned to the rest of the veterans who had filled the diner, their presence still commanding but now more relaxed. "All right, folks, let's give the Colonel some breathing room. Coffee's on me." The veterans dispersed slightly, some moving toward the counter to order drinks, while others took seats around the diner. The atmosphere, once tense and filled with dread, now felt warm and vibrant. The other patrons began to chat again, though many still cast admiring glances at Henry and his group. As Henry sat back down, a young man who had been sitting at a nearby table approached him. "Excuse me, sir," he said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. The way you handled that. You didn't even have to raise your voice." Henry looked up at him with a small, knowing smile. "Son, sometimes it's not about how loud you speak. It's about the weight behind your words." The young man nodded, clearly impressed. "I hope I can be that brave one day." Henry's smile widened slightly. "Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing up when it counts." The young man thanked him and returned to his table, leaving Henry to sip his now cold coffee. He didn't mind. He was just glad the situation had been resolved without violence. But as he glanced out the window, his sharp eyes caught sight of the bikers still lingering in the parking lot. They were talking among themselves, their movements erratic and agitated. Captain Briggs noticed too. He followed Henry's gaze and frowned. "Think they're going to try something stupid?" he asked, his voice low enough that only Henry could hear. Henry sighed and set his cup down. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but they've got bigger problems now." Briggs raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Henry didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone again, dialing another number. He didn't speak right away when the call connected, but after a pause, he said, "This is Henry. I need a favor. Looks like we've got a little cleanup to do." Briggs watched him curiously as Henry ended the call, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "You always have something up your sleeve, don't you?" Briggs said, shaking his head. Henry leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say, this isn't over yet." The bikers were still pacing in the parking lot, their frustration and embarrassment bubbling over into hushed arguments. The scarred leader threw his helmet onto the ground with a loud clatter, cursing under his breath. "I'm not letting some old man and his military buddies make fools out of us," he spat, his voice filled with barely restrained rage. One of his companions, a younger man with a nervous demeanor, hesitated. "Maybe we should just leave, man. They've got the numbers. And you saw those guys, they're serious." The leader glared at him, his jaw tightening. "No way. You think I'm going to let some old war vet humiliate me in front of everyone? Not a chance." As the argument among the bikers continued, Henry and Captain Briggs observed them from the diner's window. The other veterans had taken seats around the room, their presence still commanding but now blending into the normal diner crowd. The waitress refilled Henry's coffee, giving him a grateful smile before retreating behind the counter. Briggs leaned closer to Henry, his voice low. "So, what's the plan, Colonel? I can't imagine you're just going to let them sulk out there." Henry didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving the parking lot. Finally, he set the cup down and folded his hands on the table. "They'll make their move," he said evenly. "They always do." Briggs raised an eyebrow. "And when they do?" Henry's lips curled into a faint smile. "That's when the real fun starts." Before Briggs could question him further, the sound of more engines approaching filled the air. Everyone in the diner turned toward the window as a new set of vehicles pulled into the parking lot. These weren't ordinary cars or motorcycles. They were black SUVs with tinted windows, each bearing a discreet emblem that only a trained eye would recognize. The bikers froze, their conversation cutting off as they watched the SUVs park in a perfect line. Doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out, their movements synchronized and precise. They weren't carrying weapons, but their presence alone radiated authority and control. One of them, a tall man with a closely cropped haircut and an earpiece, stepped forward, scanning the parking lot before his eyes locked onto the diner. The scarred biker's confidence visibly faltered. Who are these guys?" he muttered, taking a half step back. Henry didn't move from his seat, but a quiet satisfaction lit up his face. Briggs leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Friends of yours." "You could say that," Henry replied, his voice calm. "Let's just call them reinforcements." The tall man in the suit entered the diner, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Henry. He approached the table with measured steps, his expression unreadable. When he reached Henry, he gave a slight nod. "Colonel," he said formally, "we're here as requested." Henry nodded back, his demeanor as steady as ever. "Thank you, Agent Carter. I appreciate your promptness." Agent Carter straightened, his tone professional but firm. "We were already nearby on assignment. When we got your call, we expedited the schedule." "What's the situation?" Henry gestured subtly toward the window. "Those gentlemen out there seem to think they can intimidate people without consequences." Carter glanced toward the parking lot, his expression hardening. "Understood. We'll handle it." As Carter turned to leave, Briggs couldn't hide his amazement any longer. "Colonel," he said, leaning closer, "are you telling me you've got federal agents on speed dial?" Henry chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Let's just say there are a few people who owe me favors." Outside, the bikers were growing visibly uneasy as the suited agents began spreading out, their presence both intimidating and authoritative. Agent Carter approached the scarred leader directly, his calm but commanding tone cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen," he said, I believe it's time for you to leave. The scarred biker tried to recover his bravado, squaring his shoulders. And who exactly are you to tell us that? He challenged, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Carter didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out a small badge, holding it up for the bikers to see. The scarred man's eyes widened as he read the lettering. You're with? Doesn't matter who we're with, Carter interrupted. What matters is that your behavior has been noted. If you don't vacate the premises immediately, we'll have no choice but to take further action. The bikers exchanged panicked glances, their earlier arrogance crumbling under the weight of the situation. All right, we're going, the scarred leader said hastily, grabbing his helmet from the ground. We don't want any trouble. As the bikers scrambled to leave, Henry watched from the diner, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Briggs shook his head in disbelief. You really do know how to handle trouble, don't you? Henry picked up his coffee again, his smile barely visible but deeply satisfied. Sometimes, Captain, he said, it's not about fighting. It's about knowing when to call for backup. The bikers hastily mounted their motorcycles, their earlier swagger replaced by a frantic urgency to leave. The scarred leader, his face pale and jaw tight, barked orders at his group. Move it! Let's get out of here! Their engines roared to life, but they no longer carried the same bravado as when they'd first arrived. The federal agents stood firm, their imposing presence ensuring there was no doubt about the bikers' departure. Agent Carter remained near the diner entrance, his sharp gaze fixed on the group as they peeled out of the parking lot one by one. The diners inside watched the scene unfold in stunned silence, a mixture of awe and relief washing over them. As the last motorcycle disappeared down the road, Carter turned back to the diner, his expression composed. He walked over to Henry, who hadn't moved from his seat. It's done, Carter said simply. They won't be bothering anyone again. Henry nodded, his face calm, though there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. Good work, Agent Carter. I knew I could count on you. The agent gave a slight nod, his demeanor remaining professional. If you need anything else, just let us know. We'll be in the area for a while. With that, the agents began filing out, their movements as precise and synchronized as when they arrived. The room seemed to exhale collectively once the last of them exited, the tension that had gripped everyone finally dissipating. The young waitress, who had been silently watching everything from behind the counter, approached Henry cautiously. Sir, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, I don't know how to thank you. I don't even know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. Henry looked up at her, his expression kind but firm. You don't have to thank me, he said. People like that thrive on fear. You just needed someone to remind them that they're not as powerful as they think. The waitress nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. You're a hero, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's lips twitched into a faint smile. Heroes are just people who step up when they're needed, he said. You'll find plenty of them around here. He glanced briefly at the other veterans in the diner, who were now chatting and sipping their coffee as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Captain Briggs, still seated across from Henry, shook his head in disbelief. Colonel, you've got to tell me. How on earth do you know guys like that? He asked, motioning toward the agents who had just left. Henry chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. When you've been in as many places and situations as I have, Captain, you learn the value of building strong relationships. Let's just say I've helped some of those folks in the past, and they don't forget things like that. Briggs leaned back, a wry smile on his face. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Henry raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. Smart man. The atmosphere in the diner began to shift back to normal, though there was still an air of admiration directed toward Henry. Some of the patrons approached him to shake his hand, while others simply nodded in respect from their tables. As things settled, Henry's eyes wandered back to the parking lot. Though the bikers were gone, a small detail caught his attention. A motorcycle helmet, forgotten in their haste, lying near the edge of the curb. He considered it for a moment, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Briggs noticed and raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Henry gestured toward the helmet. "They left something behind." Briggs shrugged. "Good riddance. Let them come back for it if they dare." But Henry shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I've got a better idea." He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate but steady despite his age. Picking up the helmet, he examined it briefly before turning to the young waitress. "Mind if I borrow a marker?" he asked. She handed him one, her curiosity evident. Henry uncapped it and carefully wrote something inside the helmet's visor before setting it back on the curb where it had been. "What did you write?" Briggs asked, his curiosity piqued. Henry smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with a mix of wisdom and mischief. "Just a little reminder," he said cryptically. Briggs didn't press further, but he couldn't help but smirk. "You're full of surprises, Colonel." Henry returned to his seat, picking up his coffee once more as the sunlight streamed through the diner windows. Outside, the helmet sat untouched, the message hidden within, waiting for the moment it would be discovered. Whatever it said, Henry seemed confident that it would deliver its intended impact. The calm returned to the diner, but the story of what had just unfolded would linger long after the coffee cups were cleared and the tables wiped down. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the diner returned to its usual rhythm. Conversations grew lively again, the clinking of utensils and the hum of the coffee machine filling the air. Yet, an unspoken reverence hung in the room, a collective acknowledgement of the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. Out in the parking lot, the forgotten helmet sat undisturbed. The bikers were long gone, their departure marked by the quiet relief of everyone inside. But Henry's message lingered, waiting to be discovered. An hour passed before the roar of a single motorcycle broke the stillness outside. Heads turned toward the window as the scarred biker returned, his face tight with frustration. He parked haphazardly and strode over to the curb, grabbing the helmet with a scowl. As he lifted it, the marker's bold ink caught his eye. He froze, his brow furrowing as he read the words written inside the visor. "Strength isn't in intimidation. It's in character. Be better." For a moment he just stood there, the weight of the message sinking in. His grip on the helmet tightened, his eyes darting toward the diner's window. Through the glass, he saw Henry sitting calmly at his table, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and something in Henry's gaze, a quiet confidence, a refusal to yield, made the biker look away. He turned sharply, walking back to his motorcycle without a word. He paused for a moment, his head hanging low, before putting on the helmet and riding away. The sound of his engine faded into the distance, leaving the parking lot empty once more. Inside, Henry set his cup down, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. Captain Briggs chuckled from across the table, shaking his head. "You really know how to get into people's heads, don't you?" Henry shrugged, his demeanor humble. "Sometimes people just need a reminder," he said. "It's not about humiliating them. It's about planting a seed." Briggs leaned back, crossing his arms. "You think he'll change?" Henry's gaze shifted back to the window, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not right away," he admitted. "But words have a way of sticking with you. Someday, when he's ready, he'll remember." The younger waitress approached again, a fresh pot of coffee in her hands. "Another refill, sir?" she asked with a bright smile. Henry nodded. "Thank you, young lady." As she poured, she glanced out the window where the biker had been moments earlier. "You think he'll come back again?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and concern. Henry shook his head. "If he does, it won't be for trouble," he said simply. The waitress seemed reassured by his calm confidence. She returned to the counter, leaving Henry and Briggs to enjoy the peace they had restored. The other veterans around the diner had also begun to relax, sharing stories and laughter as if the earlier tension had been nothing more than a passing storm. The afternoon light began to fade, casting a golden glow over the diner. Outside, the quiet parking lot seemed almost serene, as if the day's events had left a lasting imprint of calm. Henry glanced around the room, his heart warmed by the sight of the community coming back to life. The smiles, the laughter, the subtle nods of respect. They were all reminders of why he had fought, why he had served. Briggs broke the silence, his tone reflective. You know, Colonel, I've seen a lot of people handle conflict in my time, but I've never seen anyone handle it quite like you. Henry chuckled, his voice soft but steady. You learn a few things after 90 years, Captain. The most important lesson is this: real strength doesn't come from fighting. It comes from knowing when to stand your ground and when to let the other guy walk away. Briggs nodded, clearly impressed. Well, here's to 90 more years of teaching us all how it's done. Henry raised his coffee cup in a mock toast, his smile widening. I'll drink to that. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, the diner settled into the quiet comfort of the evening. Henry leaned back in his chair, content, knowing that sometimes the most powerful battles are the ones fought with calm resolve, quiet courage, and a simple message of hope.